I am delighted to have you join in this celebration of Filipe Maia's recent book, Trading Futures, a Theological Critique of Financialized Capitalism. We've been doing these book events for our faculty to celebrate their publications and to recognize them, so we're really delighted to have you in the room, and we are going to have a really wonderful conversation today. So I'm going to introduce each of the persons on our panel, and then Dr. Filipe Maia will give a short introduction to the book, so you have a sense of its content. We'll hear from each of the panelists. Dr. Maia will give a short response to the panelists' words, and then we'll open up to Q&A. So Filipe Maia is assistant professor of theology at the School of Theology at Boston University. His research and teaching focus on liberation theologies and liberation philosophies, continental philosophy, theology and economics, and the Christian eschatological imagination. And today we have a wonderful occasion to recognize and engage this new book, Trading Futures, and hear reflections from colleagues as well as your own engagement with that. I'm also delighted to welcome and introduce our panelists, our distinguished panelists, Dr. Nimi Wariboko, Dr. Becky Copeland, and SDH PhD student Jaira Koh. Dr. Nimi Wariboko is Walter G. Muelder Professor of Social Ethics at Boston University School of Theology. A world-renowned scholar and gifted teacher, his scholarship covers topics such as economic ethics, Christian social ethics, African social traditions, Pentecostal studies, and philosophical theology. He has published multiple books and articles, including God and Money, Ethics and Time, The Pentecostal Principle, Split God, Split Time, and most recently, Transcripts of the Sacred in Nigeria. Our second panelist is Dr. Rebecca Copeland, also assistant professor of theology here at the School of Theology. Dr. Copeland's scholarship engages Christian theology, ethics, and biblical studies, focusing on the intersections of religion and ecology. She's author of Created Being, Expanding Creedal Christology, and her current book project is Entangled Being, Unoriginal Sin and Wicked Problems. This book develops an understanding of unoriginal sin to address the unintentional, communal, and multi-generational challenges of climate change, environmental racism, and other wicked problems. She's also Provincial Deacon of the United Methodist Church and a member of UMC Creation Justice Vocations Working Group. And I'm delighted to welcome Jaira Koh, a PhD student here in theology, ethics, and philosophy, and a proud member of the Boston University Graduate Workers Union. His research is interested in how liberation theologians approach questions of utopia and utopianism, how Marxist feminists approach questions of social reproduction, and in their mutual loving critique. All right, so please join me in welcoming this distinguished group.
Okay, good afternoon. Thanks for being here. Thank you, Dean Koch, for the introductions. Sarah, for putting this together. I'm really glad to see all of you here. I'm humbled that you would take some time in this busy time of the semester to come and listen to a book talk. My introduction will be very brief. I just want to situate the main argument and structure of the book to get us started. So the book plays with the double meaning of the word future as the name of that which is to come, our hopes and aspirations for the future, but also as the name of a commodity that one can buy and sell in financial markets. I'm suggesting that, in fact, the proliferation of futures in the latter sense, that is, in the financial sense, is impacting our ability to imagine and hope for the future as a time that is to come. Financial capitalism, I'm arguing, is shaping our understanding and expectations for the future. There are two parts to the book and to the development of the argument. The first is a critical interpretation of the reality of financial capitalism, which I described as a project that colonizes the future. These are the first three chapters in the book. The second part, which is the more theological, explicitly theological and constructive dimension of the book, retrieves the work of Latin American liberation theologians and lands on this concept of fugitive future. So chapter 4 is a retrieval and study of the work of the theologian and economist Francine Lammert. Chapter 5 is a study on the work of the theologian and poet Rubem Alves. And the final chapter, chapter 6, is my engagement with Catherine Keller's work on apocalypse and Black critical studies and the concept of fugitivity that one finds in Fred Moten and Stefano Harney. I'm suggesting that the future is the ultimate fugitive that runs away from the attempts by capitalism to manage and predict the future for the sake of profit. That is my elevator pitch about this book, to save you the time of having to read through this at this time of the semester. And I will stop here and looking forward to your conversation. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm glad and happy to be here, and I want to offer my insights about the book, and I made a diagram of kind of the structure of the book to make it easy. So, Professor Filipe Maia's brilliant book appeals to me in multiple ways. I will name only 4 of them. First, it is a thoroughgoing liberation theological critique of not only finance capital, but also financialized capitalism. Second, the book focuses on how financialized capitalism subjectivizes citizens, creating the subjects it needs to maintain its grip on society. It's a welcome addition to the field of economic ethics. That is the focus on subjectivity and capitalism. Third, Trading Futures engages how finance capitalism has distorted and rendered monstrous the basic human inclination to make provisions for the future. Capitalism has captured our futures, formatted them for its profit, and rendered persons all over the world desperate and hopeless. Yet, Filipe finds the cracks and the spaces for liberating hope that discloses the enclosures of capitalism, of finance capitalism, in the direction of just, unformatted, and unforeclosable futures. Finally, I love his approach to economic theology. Economic theology is driven by debates between 2 schools of thought. Number 1, the archaeological school led by Robert Nelson that traces contemporary economic thought to its earlier theological foundations, and the genealogical school led by J.J. Agabin proceeds from late antiquity theology to modern economic order. As powerful and widespread as these 2 schools are, I find them rather constrictive. For years, I've advanced a different approach that will study the situation, as Paul Tillich will tell me, the situation of an economy to search out the chances of escape from the oppressive grips of capitalism and point to social transformation. Such an approach will engage in an elaboration of the logic of capitalism and a mode of mindfulness and attentiveness to human freedom in the organization of social life. It will focus on human freedom that precedes the freedom of capital. The freedom that others' life in a community precedes capital. Such an economic theology is a way of theorizing, engaging, or seeing the world that emphasizes the following: A, social transformation; B, reduction of domination, discrimination, oppression; and C, commitment to justice and human flourishing for all. Such a methodology ascends connections of ideas, theories, and theologies to praxis, to the social practice of change. Filipe Maia's book does all this. I have also done this in my economic theology books. I pray our combined efforts lead to a new thinking about economic theology in the global academy. I prophesy that a day will come when the theologians and ethicists will be talking about busting economic theology as they once talked about busting personalism. Let me now pivot to offer a personal reading of the book and lay out what I think is the inner structure of the book's argument. Maia has produced his argument against financialized capitalism through a dynamic quadrilateral square, a dynamic quadrilateral structure. So if you read the book, he has theology is equal to God's talk. Capitalism is equal to future talk. And within that square, right, so both forms of talk deliver the discourse of promise. That's what holds both forms of talk. God talk and future talk are held together by promise, and you can see it in the pages of the book, especially pages 116 to 117. Capitalism and God are fighting for your attention and time. So in both they are fighting for our time of now and our time to come, right? So pay attention to the potential opposing relationship: God, capitalism, theology, and future talk. So these oppositions go through all the book. The elements are defined by their difference from one another. These four elements cross, multiply, and combine in multiple ways in the book. So they're just like crisscrossing together. They are not just placed side by side without interaction. They interact and mingle to cast and recast the arguments of the book. The various combinations are subject to the constraint of maximization of just up. So that the elements are going on, but in mathematics, they're subject to a constraint that whatever the discussion is, they must lead to just up. With a parallel shift, the four elements table changes to a kind of square similar to the semiotic square in linguistic theory. The semiotic theory. I will call this the Theonesis square. Once see the figure, you see how it goes. It works like the semiotic square in linguistic theory, right? So the semiotic square to signify the nexus of discourse circulating around God and capitalism. So the book is a discourse, and a discourse on discourse circulating around capitalism and God. I'm not saying that the Theonesis square is at the same level of intellectual sophistication as the semiotic square. That's not why I introduced it. I'm not saying I've discovered a new theory. But the Theonesis square allows us to see how Maia combined associated meaning to create layered and crossing effective and affective analysis. Effective and affective analysis also, or interpretation of capitalism. So if you look at it, so once they are like theology and God goes together, capitalism and future, but once you cross them, you get this idea of how the book is. That's why it's dynamic, playing around with this the different. So if you look at the capitalism and God talk seems to be in opposition, right? Capitalism and God talk, and that's what the book says. And then you look at theology and finance. That in his book they are contradiction. Theology and future talk definitely in contradiction. Future talk and capitalism are complementary on the same level, and then God talk and theology is complementary also. What we talk about God, and then we have God talk and future talk. I will call it haunted hybridity. Anytime you want to combine God talk and the future talk of capitalism, you are going to be haunted. Right, so it's an haunted hybridity. And then theology, liberation theology and capitalism are impossible synthesis in the book. You cannot combine liberation theology and capitalism together and sleep very well. In the book, it's an impossible thing. Then, so if you play around with these four elements, it takes you to another, what they call Lacanian insights it will give you, that if you look at liberation theology and capitalism is the real, what Lacan would say, the impossible, but that which also can come true, right? So it's the impossible, and then God talk and future talk is the imaginary. Now, some capitalism can imagine that. In the future, those two can and Filipe says, no, it cannot come together. And then you have God talk and theology. It's kind of symbolic. It's the symbolic structure of his whole argument that that kind of gives off the structure of that. That is as Lacan would say. And then future talk and capitalism is the symptom, right? It's at the same time what holds the system together, and at the same time, in Lacan, something that holds the system together is also at that point the system can break apart. So future talk and capitalism. So Filipe is nipping at that. What holds capitalism together is that future talk, but at the same time, it what holds it together, but at the same time, that is the spot where it can fall apart. Right. As I read the book, I imagine or conjured Filipe gingerly walking on the lines that connected the elements to form the Theonesis square. He manipulated the four elements, juggling ideas as he walked on the ropes that joined them with the dexterity of a tightrope walker at the top of his game. Did you notice the knot at the spot where the four elements intersect? What is the name of the knot that holds the four modes of discourses of the economy and theology in the book? It is an unsaid in the book. The book does not tell us the common domain of theology and economics. Next, I will endeavor to decipher the unsaid of the trading future. Since he reads Derrida a lot, he should. So there's an unsaid. What exactly holds them together? Right. Yeah, the knot that holds the four lines of the Theonesis square together in the book is time. Capitalism and God, theology and future talk are all about time. The time of the future, and the how of capturing the not yet of time. The answer begs another question. What holds together the three temporal modes of the economy or the discourse? If it's time, then what holds the three modes of time together? That's a question Neville spent 40 years in his scholarship trying to answer. Right, what holds things together? I will name the human creative arts as a knot that not only holds the lines of Theonesis square together, but also the temporal modes of the economy and discourse. The creative art is the ultimate reality of the economy and discourse about it. It is the locus or the nexus of mutual interaction, a condition of possibility for the existence of interaction. It is the context in which creative things, the creativity of discourse and the temporal modes of the overall economy are relevant to one another. The context itself is not determinate. It is in this context of creativity that the four discourses of God, theology, capitalism, and future talk find their mutual relevance, the context of their relating. They are all products of human creative act, as I explained in one of my books. Right. So finally, my last paragraph. At the core of human creativity is the not yet, the novum, which is to come. Creativity, like eschatology or the not yet, takes to the edge's chance of transformation and disclosure. Creativity, as the site of mutual relevance of the four elements, as the unstable stabilizing force of the yet and the not yet, does not assume a location like epistemological, ontological, or social, outside and external to itself. It creates the very space, the location it moves into. In this movement, it does not abandon the actual historical circumstances that propel it, a concern of Maia's book of Just Hope on page 114 to 117. The kind of promise that does not celebrate an extra historical reality is at the heart of the human creative act, especially when both creativity and promise are properly and broadly understood in the light of Ruben Alves' book, The Theology of Human Hope, a book that I've also used in many of my works. When I put the common domain of theology and economics in the trading with the works of economic theologian Philip Goodchild and mine, a pattern emerges that what others Filipe's discourse, or what is the basis, the knot of his work, is time. While for a major economic theologian like Philip Goodchild of UK is human trust. How does capitalism works with trust and dismembers human trust? I have in my own worked with the idea of what I've just explained, the creative human act. The same thing Neville will say, the creative act that holds all activities together. The ordering is future-oriented for all these scholars. Of course, each one of them includes the elements of the other types of ordering in their work. The unique difference is in the groundless ground of their economic theologies. So the groundless ground of what Filipe is dealing with here is time. Philip Goodchild is dealing with trust. I deals with human creativity, but you could see how each one of us are playing with these three. Could give you a meta framework of today how economic theology works. Let me conclude by asking this question: what does it mean to interpret the trading of humanity's futures in terms of impact on human creativity, the thwarting of the process of actualization of human potentialities in late capitalism? Thank you.
Thank you, Filipe. Thank you, Dean Pak, for inviting me to be part of this panel. I would caution you, never ask an author questions about their book when they're putting together a book panel, or you may end up on it. So I have taken the invitation that Dr. Maia gave me to raise these questions here. So I have written this with questions directed towards him. Today I wanted to lift up a few thoughts that arose because I am an eco-theologian, and a question that comes up because I am a systematician, even though you continue to deny it. So first, your book was my first in-depth engagement with Marxist thought. So there might be strands of interpretation or criticism that engage with what I am raising that I'm unfamiliar with. But I was wondering if expanding Marxist treatment of human labor to encompass environmental labor might be a fruitful area to include in your own reflections. On page 66, you write of human labor that in the marketplace there is one peculiar commodity whose use value, its utility, is to create value. Its very consumption is in fact productive. Unlike other commodities, labor power is the one commodity whose use in fact is not a mere consumption but also a creation. Whereas regular commodities are used up as they are consumed, labor power creates something as it is consumed, end quote. As I read this, often by my garden, I could not stop thinking about seeds, because seeds are commodities whose utility is to create value, whose very consumption is in fact productive, and who create something as they are consumed. A single tomato seed produces a tomato plant that creates dozens, even hundreds in the cases of my cherry tomatoes, of tomatoes and thousands of new tomato seeds. These tomatoes can be harvested, eaten, given away, or sold. Their seeds can be saved, cleaned, dried, and then sold, traded, or used to grow new plants in the future. Certainly, there's human labor involved in planting, tending, and harvesting the plant, as well as in saving the seeds. But the human labor does not create the value of the tomato or the seed by itself. So that's one specific example, but there are uncountable ways in which non-human labor creates value for human use and exchange, without ever being included in the calculations either of economics or of what we might owe to the rest of creation. The inputs of plant, animal, and fungal labor into the production of food, fibers, and lumber seems to be left out of the calculations altogether. And environmental contributions go beyond these obvious examples. Wetlands provide flood control and water filtration services. Mangrove swamps and coral reefs provide protection from storm surges and erosion. Bees and other pollinators keep our fruits, vegetables, and nuts producing. Rainforests and ocean plankton sequester carbon dioxide and provide the oxygen we need to breathe. There's a debate over whether such ecosystem services can be assigned dollar values and over whether they should be brought into the discourse of monetary valuation, largely because so many of them are literally priceless. They are both irreplaceable and they are necessary for life to continue. So my question is, does the idea of environmental labor, that human labor is not unique in creating as it is consumed, pose an insurmountable challenge to this line of Marxist thought, or can it complicate your thinking about time and value in productive ways? Under capitalism, not only the human ability to produce, but also the rest of the earth's ability to do so is, as you write, appropriated and exploited in the pursuit of profit. And when we're talking about the rest of the earth's work, we're often talking about labor that has taken decades, centuries, and millennia to accomplish its goals. And the duration of environmental labor that goes into generating many of the things that we consume in an instant turned my thinking to fossil fuels, just as I came to your poignant observation that, quote, the future of multitudes is consumed by the excesses of the few. Coal, oil, methane, permafrost tundra, ocean, rainforest. These are the things that made this planet hospitable to mammalian life. Over hundreds and thousands of years, Earth processes have sequestered gigatons of carbon in underground deposits, creating the relatively stable climate that's persisted throughout the entirety of human history. Photosynthetic living systems carry on the day-to-day work of removing carbon dioxide from the air and using solar energy to convert it to carbohydrates that run the rest of life on this planet. And in the last 75 years, the few have used exploited workers to dig up and burn those deposits to fuel factories where other exploited workers have turned out goods that we do not need, that we go further into debt to buy. In the last 75 years, the few have altered land use practices that had persisted for thousands of years in ways that leave us at the brink of, if not already past, too many climactic tipping points to register. The systems that once sequestered carbon are now releasing more of it into the atmosphere as tundra and rainforests become net carbon sources rather than carbon sinks. The future of multitudes that has been consumed by the excesses of the few include the futures of their own children, the future of human civilizations, and the future of many other forms of life that call this planet home. And so does fugitive futurity have a word to whisper into this bleak reality? And then on a very different note, your examination invokes various resonances between classical Christian claims and the problems that you so astutely identify in Financialized Capitalism. I would note three. First, when discussing the formation of the indebted subject, you cite Simon Wortham to argue that forgiving a debt creates an existential dependency on the creditor. Second, you twice invoke the Schuld wordplay, in which the German word for debt is the same as the German word for guilt. And this takes on a particular resonance when you engage Adam Kotsko's logic of culpability, which treats the subject as entirely depraved and entirely blameworthy, noting that, quote, indebted subjects are at once fallen and guilty. And third, you argue that neoliberal future talk is bound to sacrificial logic, in which some must be sacrificed now for a deferred future prosperity. You end this section with the claim that nothing that projects itself onto the future as worthy of sacrifice can be liberating. You and your interlocutors are using language fraught with centuries of theological debates over the concepts of original sin, human responsibility, human contingency and dependency, ascetic practices, and the effects that substitutionary models of atonement have had on intrahuman relations, particularly when self-sacrifice has become an ideal that gets imposed on others by some with power. But I'm curious as to whether you think that these ideas, human dependency on God, human fallenness, that human beings are nevertheless responsible or culpable for their sins, and that perhaps there is something salvific about Jesus' death. Whether these ideas have been idolatrously co-opted into neoliberalism, or are they just irredeemably bad theology from the beginning? Do you find any of these to be worthy of holding on to, worth reconstructing? Or are you more in line with Mary Daly's criticism that if the symbol can be used in this bad way, and indeed has a long history of being used in this bad way, that there's something irredeemably wrong with the symbol itself? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Maia, for the chance to respond and to follow the excellent comments from Dr. Wariboko and Dr. Copeland. I'll begin by reading 3 excerpts from Trading Futures that I think capture its movement, but also open a way for reading the present otherwise. So first, the place from which the text speaks. Quote, I want to reflect on the pause one makes when saying that the future is not yet. The Christian imagination of the future finds its breathing room in the pause of the not yet. End quote. Second, that which the text speaks against. Quote, other modes of future talk also inhabit this pause engendered by the recurrence of this not yet. Future talk is also a key weapon to validate and expand nefarious projects. In our times, Catherine Keller posits, the codes of the Christian eschatological vocabulary have been smoothly integrated into a military-industrial info-media empire with the power to fulfill much so-called prophecy, end quote. And third, that which the text speaks alongside. Quote, the edges of Christian eschatology have long been punctuated by the future talk of the marginalized. Liberation theologians have embraced this heritage, showing that on the margins of society, future talk functions not simply as the extreme of a countable series, but as a demand that one indeed moves on to a new story, end quote. I cannot help hearing Palestine on every page. And I here must note the uncanny rhyming of the 75-year mark that Dr. Copeland pointed to with regards to fossil fuel extraction. 1, 2, 3, 4, occupation no more, goes one of the staple call and echo chants at Palestinian solidarity rallies. 1, 2, 3, 4 comes the call, accountable series. Occupation no more is its echo, its future talk. And between them, the breathing room of the pause, necessary to keep chanting and marching for hours. Repeating these familiar chants is a pedagogical ritual. For precisely the reasons why from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, is harder to say today, more desperate. It's all the more necessary to repeat. I overheard an older protester last week say that the banner she was carrying was one she'd been reusing at Palestine rallies since 2008. But there is more to hear. 1, 2, 3, 4 I heard at a rally last week, knowing where the chant is going, predicting where it will. 1, 2, 3, 4 we repeat. The pause of the not yet. And then, a new story. 1, 2, 3, 4, Gaza broke the prison door. Not only the countable series interrupted, but our familiarity with the means for its interruption is itself interrupted. Our capacity for future talk deconstructed, that is, differentiated and deferred, by Palestinians bulldozing the border fence and Palestinians defiantly future talking about it. Interrupted is the so-called prophecy of the military-industrial infomedia empire. Ruined is Israel's futurity of inexorable, slower motion genocide and its policy of normalization, predicated as they were on the technologies of an unassailable Iron Dome and an inescapable apparatus of Palestinian surveillance and control. Dispelled is the assurance of mastery over the practice of colonialism, the kind of mastered future talk that makes Israel so compelling to investors. Dr. Maia describes the unsolvable paradox of financialized capitalism as in fact the source of its power. I quote, at the moment of indecision about future outcomes, the temporal logic of neoliberalism quickens the conservation of the status quo, end quote. Against the prospect of an uncertain future, Israel had asserted the surety of its self-conservation by technological superiority, which is that, quote, definite certainty as to what needs to be done in the absence of accurate knowledge of the future, to use language from Trading Futures. We need not even look to Palestinian activists or liberation theologians for such a description of Israel. Listen to this introduction from an article in Institutional Investor, an international finance magazine. A white drone with a 12-foot wingspan banks sharply over an artificial lake on the outskirts of Tel Aviv. So quiet that herons on the water's edge don't budge until the hawk-like aircraft is barely 100 feet away. Its cameras beam high-resolution images of the terrain and the birds onto a large outdoor screen for a rapt audience of military analysts and arms buyers, while a presenter extols the aircraft's virtues. It allows a military unit to peer down on enemies hidden behind hills or buildings and then call in artillery or airstrikes, he says. What does such vaunted mastery over the unknown mean? Quote, a rising tide of foreign investment from global tech giants, the article continues, from venture capital firms eager to finance hot new startups. Israel is the world's second largest leading exporter after the US of both military drones and cybersecurity services. End quote. The feeling of the apartheid wall coming down on October 7th, on the other hand, was like when 6 Palestinian political prisoners broke out of Israeli prison in 2021 for Mariam Barghouti, a Palestinian American based in the West Bank. We breathed freedom with them as if we were also free, she says. But immediately after the exhilaration of the prison break, Barghouti says, comes the terrifying realization of what comes next. The dark premonition, they are going to kill us all. For the future talk of the marginalized, of the liberation theologians in trading futures, is not itself a future talk of certainty, not some neat swap of predictable oppression for predictable liberation. As Fred Moten and Dr. Maia say, if there's such a thing as freedom, whatever it is much more accurately denoted precisely because it is emphatically deferred, displaced, deconstructed by the term/activity of escape. Escape here is a tactic to hijack the hold of the present. And it has been hijacked. As Palestinian Jewish civil rights attorney Dylan Saba says, everything that has happened since October 7th is this very chaotic and violent release of energy that has been building in a way that feels tectonic. The structural forces, the forms of colonization and imperialism, had been exerting pressure within a relatively stable set of relationships. That pressure was building and would have moments of friction, but without any major releases or big shifts. It felt as though the Hamas attack was the beginning of an earthquake caused by that pressure exceeding a threshold. And everything that's happened since has been a total mess of contingency, where things are crashing into each other. Everything is open in terms of possibility. That's the vertigo, the feeling of standing still while everything appears to be moving fast around us, end quote. So if the Christian imagination of the future finds its breathing room in the pause of the not yet, as Dr. Maia writes, that I think it's precisely within this unspeakable, vertiginous pause that trading futures impels liberation theologians today, impels me today, to declare that which we must speak against, those we speak alongside, and the absent not yet that we must nevertheless name. Gaza, Gaza, don't you cry. We will never let you die. Gaza, Gaza, don't you cry. Palestine will never die.
I must, of course, begin by thanking the members of the panel with deep gratitude for the care with which they read the book and for the generous comments that they offered. There's even a diagram, so can you imagine that, how generous it is? Yeah. There's a lot for me to think about, and I'm grateful for the fact that I cannot answer to all of your questions here, but I'll do my best to respond to many of them, or as much as I can. Let me open with a response to the prophecy that Professor Wariboko has made. It's a good prophecy. So, in the language of trading futures, I'm inclined to say that the promise of a Boston School of Economic Theology makes sense. That is to say, it offers meaning, but also provides directions for possible futures. So as a promise in this sense, it is true not in its fulfillment, but by virtue of the possibility it conjures up. As it is the case with all promises we make to each other, they must be tendered and cared for. So for me, Professor Wariboko's prophecy is not simple prediction, but it's an opening of a possible horizon, but also a call to responsibility. And I'm personally very excited to answer that call. Professor Wariboko offers a typology of different responses to the possible common domain shared by theology and economics. In his own work, Wariboko suggests that the not, right there in that diagram, is the human creative act, while Philip Goodchild would place trust, and I, in my work, would identify time as that moment of integration. And I find these distinctions very helpful, and I agree that my point of entry in the debate of economic theology is, in fact, time. In one of the chapters, I offer a reading of Marx's Capital that is precisely suggesting that the book is a way of Marx addressing capitalism as a massive transfer of time from one class to the other. So let me get to the right page here. I also want to name that for me, the not there is certainly time, but I want to clarify that I think that it's future time would be my point of insistence here. I might prefer the name of future time, or that is the knot that is connecting the pieces of trading futures with this category of a time to come. It's not time in general that intrigues me, but time as construed along the edges of Christian eschatology, as well as a certain messianic disposition to think of time not in terms of presence, but in the mood of a to come, of what ought to come, what must come. That insistence on the to come is my way of naming the future as possibility, which necessarily connects me to the thought of the future as a creative act. As Professor Wariboko mentioned in his response, my own engagement with Rubem Alves is tied to a commitment to thinking of theology as a form of poiesis, a creative act. I suggest in the book that naming absences is an important nickname for the work of Future Talk, insofar as the naming of these absences is also an invocation, a summons of sorts. In that sense, though with different degrees of emphasis, I do believe that there is an important point of connection in what I try to accomplish in this book and what Professor Wariboko does in his works, not only in economic theology, but also in Pentecostal theology and African theologies and philosophies. To Professor Copeland's Theological invitation, I can only say yes, of course. I'm on board. And may the conversations come, and may they begin. I must also name that there is a limitation to my project in trading futures, and the unfortunate reality that I wrote a book about the future without an explicit discussion of the real possibility that several life forms on this planet currently have no future. And I regret not saying that. So first, I would respond to Professor Copeland's questions on Marxist theory of value by suggesting that I think it ought to be possible to think of labor power in more than human ways, and that yes, it is important to elaborate on the category of environmental labor, or perhaps earth labor. As everything within Marxism, there are splits in this debate, so there is one ongoing split on how to deal with Marx and the ecological crisis. But I'm of the opinion that it is possible to think with Marx on value and under our current situation. In Marx, one can find sort of inklings of that possible theory of value when he addresses in Capital and elsewhere that human labor is never alone in the social process of the creation of value. In his words, nature is always already there. But it's often there in a somewhat passive way, waiting for it to be activated by human labor. That is the part of Marx that I think needs to be updated. But there's a second point that I want to make here that is about the category of earth labor, the possibility of the category of earth labor. And here I'm already thinking with Professor Copeland, not with Marx necessarily. And so in talking about seeds and tomato seeds and all sorts of seeds, I thought about the ways in which companies are genetically modifying and creating seeds. And then creating patents for them, which means they're privatizing those seeds as ways of cornering the market so that you need to buy those seeds and also the fertilizers that go with them. So that is a way of commodifying the seeds that intrigues me. So I would love to think with Professor Copeland. That's my answer with an my answer of an invitation with another invitation. I would love to think with Professor Copeland how earth labor can be thought of as a mobilizing of earthlings toward a planetary strike against these forms of seed production. So the revolution of the seeds would be my goal here. On the question of language of classical theology, I do believe that the forces of financial capitalism shape our thinking and the project of theology in general, including motifs in classical theology. So if I affirm that I owed an immense debt to Christ's redemptive work, I do so under material conditions where I think of debt in ways that have been shaped by financial capitalism. So I'm thinking, in addition to my debt to Christ, I'm also thinking about my mortgage, my student debt, the fear of becoming ill, and having to acquire medical debt to pay for my bills. And I would love to ask and think, how has Christ ransomed us from those debts as well? I certainly would hope that Christ can do that. But by saying that, I would have, I think, to modulate the vocabulary of classical theology by attending to the reality of an economy of debt. That is to say, the vocabulary of classical theology is now circulating in an imaginary where debt has expanded its semantic field. To complete my answer, I find the iconoclastic project of getting rid of the vocabulary of Christian theology unhelpful, and paradoxically very modernist in its hope of founding an altogether new vocabulary for theology. So in this sense, I would depart from Mary Daly. To paraphrase Marx one last time, I would say that we produce theology, and we can offer creative ways of talking about God, but we do so in conditions not of our own making. So I have no qualms with the vocabulary of classical theology as long as it's properly modulated by the demands and semantic fields of that discourse in our present context. And now Palestine. Jaira Koh's response is a brilliant way of thinking about the pause of the not yet as a radical moment for the possibility of the escape. I'm very grateful that Jaira would name the repetitions of slogans and chants of resistance, as well as the eruptions they might provoke and the eruption that in fact they are. Most of all, I'm thankful for Jaira for establishing the connection between the war on Gaza and trading futures. To my mind, the conflict between the State of Israel and Hamas is overdetermined by the forms of violent future talk, eschatological predictions, and military apparatuses for the control of populations and their futures. I'm constantly reminded over the past month or so of the forms of Christian Zionism that cast the State of Israel as the thermometer of cataclysmic events, or better still, as the chronometer of end-of-days events. This measuring of time for the sake of predicting what is to come is, for me, the point of contact between eschatological motifs and the management of the future in financial discourse. Christian Zionism, in this sense, mobilizes economic and political powers in North America that sponsor the violence against Palestinians, all the while covering the tracks of the supersessionism without which Christian Zionism could not exist. This type of future talk produces expectations that are confined and confining. It wants to be inexorable. It arrogates to itself the power of inescapability. Until, of course, escapes occur. These are fragile, mournful, and nevertheless persistent in the demand that there is always a pause between now and then. If I may commit the danger of self-citation, I want to close these remarks by reading the final 2 paragraphs from this book, just as a way of summarizing what I've tried to accomplish in here and also my response to the panel. This book has tracked the futures traded in financial markets and how they engender our collective futures, subjecting us to their promises of future wealth. And yet, future talk continues to offer multiple senses. It exceeds the future-predicting aspirations of financialized capitalism. Hoping against the futures of financial discourse is a symptom of the abject conditions of life under financialization. It signals that hope is not exhausted by the capitalist colonial ventures into the future. There is cause for hope because there is a material need for hope. On the edges of the capitalist control over the means of prediction, there remains the cut, the break, the bleak hope of an escape route. No, we cannot escape the future, for it escapes us first. The future, forever deferred, forever coming and departing, is the everlasting fugitive. Such a time cannot be escaped, but in its name we escape as we fail to accommodate to the iron cage of the present. This fugitive future escapes us, escapes our grasp, escapes our predictions, runs away from our most endearing hope. But in our escape routes, we may ourselves be conjured up by hope, for it is the future itself that is unveiled before us in our fugitive routes. The future, the time that is not yet. The future, the fugitive, impossibly captive, forever captivating. Thank you.